The edge of the pool was slick from the wind and salt that clung to the stone, and I was still laughing at something Greg had said about the sunscreen when my foot slipped under the surface and missed the bottom step entirely, and before I had time to reach for anything or even gasp. When I slipped at the pool, Jake helped me up, but his grip on my shoulder lingered inappropriately long. The way he held me felt deliberate rather than helpful, making it clear this was about establishing some kind of claim rather than genuine assistance. I didn't move, and neither did he. And in that suspended second, I felt the air go still between us, and I hated how my body noticed that his hand was warm even through the chill, and that his breath was steady while mine was not, and that I hadn't said anything. Then, just as quickly as it began, his hand released and dropped away without apology or glance. But the damage had already been done, because now I couldn't unfeel the pressure or forget the shape of that grip. And when I turned to face him, he was already walking up toward the deck, with a towel slung casually over his shoulder like nothing had happened. We had arrived 2 days earlier, just the three of us, Greg, me, and his son from his first marriage, Jake, who had just turned 19, and who, I had told myself repeatedly, was still learning how to be around other adults, still adjusting to his father's second marriage, still carrying the awkward weight of transition. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The house was small in the way rental homes near the water always are. One of those beige prefab cottages with fake shutters and too many seashell decorations, with only 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that melted into the living room without borders or privacy. So everything felt like it happened on top of each other, and there was no door you could close without someone hearing the latch. Greg said it would be fun, said we needed this time together, said 6 days wasn't long, but long enough to make memories, and I nodded and agreed and packed sundresses and paperbacks and told myself to stay relaxed. But what I hadn't prepared for was the way the house tightened around us after the second night, like walls closing in slowly, while everyone kept smiling. Greg worked remotely and had warned me that he would still need to take meetings, and I was fine with that at first. I liked the quiet, liked reading with the sound of the sea nearby, liked the chance to reset after the madness of the wedding and the move, but the quiet didn't stay quiet for long, not with Jake always. Nearby, always within view, never loud or rude, but always present in a way that made me forget how to breathe the way I usually did. He was always watching. Not in the way teens glance or observe adults they don't understand, not like someone bored or curious or even uncomfortable. No, Jake watched like someone who knew what he was doing, like he studied people the way a cat studies birds from behind the curtain, patient, confident, and without guilt. I'd feel it in the back of my neck when I walked from the bedroom to the fridge, when I bent to tie my sandals, when I leaned across the sink to scrub a dish. His eyes found me before I could pretend they hadn't. And every time I told myself it was innocent, every time I reminded myself I was being paranoid, something in his gaze would shift just slightly, like he was confirming that I noticed too. He rarely wore a shirt, even when the morning air still held a chill from the sea mist, and the first time I looked twice, I blamed the angle, the sun, the way my coffee hadn't kicked in yet. But I started to notice that I was noticing, not once or twice, but often, and not just his bare shoulders or the line of his jaw, or the way he stretched when reaching for something on the top shelf, but the fact that he never looked away when I caught him staring. There was no embarrassment, no quick turn, no teenager's sheepish grin, just this quiet acknowledgement that settled in my stomach heavier each day. That morning, he made me tea without asking, placed it silently on the counter while I scrolled, through photos on my phone and avoided eye contact, and when I glanced up, he said simply, "Dad told me you like jasmine." But Greg had never said that. Greg didn't even know the name of the tea I drank. I smiled anyway, thanked him, and sipped it, even though the heat made my hands shake a little because I didn't want to admit how well he'd been paying attention. While preparing snacks, Jake deliberately stood too close behind me and made unnecessary physical contact while reaching for items, making it clear these touches were intentional rather than accidental. I stood still. I told myself there wasn't enough space in the kitchen, that maybe he hadn't meant it. But the part of me that had already memorized the weight of his hand on my shoulder didn't believe that anymore. And the part of me that didn't flinch, that didn't step aside or laugh it off, scared me more than anything he had done so far. Greg came out later and stretched with a yawn and said, "You and Jake seem to be getting along well. That's good. He's not the easiest kid." I nodded too fast. I smiled too easily. I said nothing, because what could I say? That his son was learning how to corner me with silence? That I was beginning to see the edges of something I hadn't expected? One evening, Jake emerged from the bathroom barely dressed and asked about his swim shorts, in a way that was clearly designed to get my attention. Despite trying to look away, I found myself looking longer than appropriate, which he clearly noticed and seemed pleased about. I didn't answer him, didn't turn back to explain that his shorts were folded by the deck chair outside. Didn't offer an excuse or a smile or anything at all, because I knew that if I spoke, the sound of my voice would betray the pressure, building just beneath my skin, and I knew from the way he watched me that silence was louder than any words I could have chosen. I kept walking, kept my steps even, kept my eyes down and my arms tight against my sides as if I could squeeze the moment out of existence. But the truth followed me into the kitchen, into the dim space where the overhead light buzzed faintly, and the scent of salt still clung to the counters, and I stood there with my hands resting flat on the laminate like I needed the surface to steady me. I stared at the tea mug he'd left earlier, still sitting untouched by the sink, and I realized that everything about this place felt too close, too personal, too exposed to breathe right. The next morning started the way most did on that trip, with Greg already locked in the guest room turned office, his voice muffled behind the thin door, fingers no doubt flying over the keyboard while a dozen people waited on Zoom for his input about things I never fully understood. I tiptoed around the hallway like a guest in my own vacation, careful not to speak too loudly or open the wrong drawer or disrupt his workflow, and by the time I reached the kitchen, the kettle had already boiled. Jake was standing at the counter, again, shirtless, hair still damp from a quick rinse, and without turning to look at me, he lifted the mug from the tray and held it out with that same unnerving calm I'd started to recognize. "You like it steeped a little longer, right?" he asked, not waiting for confirmation, and as I took the mug from his hand, I felt my fingers brush his. I didn't mean for them to. I didn't want them to. But they did, and neither of us moved. I sat down at the small table tucked near the window, the one with the cracked corner and the view of the neighbor's overgrown hedge, and pretended to scroll my phone as if that screen could offer me protection. Jake sat across from me, legs stretched out like he owned the space, his eyes, not on his cereal, not on the tide chart pinned to the fridge, but on me. Always on me. I tried to sip the tea slowly, tried to ground myself in its warmth, but even that tasted different now, because I didn't know if I was drinking it out of habit or because he had prepared it. We spent the afternoon indoors because the wind had picked up and the clouds had rolled in heavy with a promise of rain, and while Greg buried himself in back-to-back meetings, Jake and I passed each other in the cramped living room, with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel restful, the kind that stretches between people who are thinking too much and saying too little. I picked up a magazine I didn't want to read, flipped pages I didn't see, and tried not to react when Jake leaned over to plug in his charger, his arm brushing my knee as he did, his fingers grazing the couch cushion just beside my thigh. No apology, no acknowledgement. I kept my spine straight and my eyes forward and didn't say a word. Later that evening, when the rain finally started and the sound of it filled the house with soft, echoing rhythm, Greg emerged from the bedroom with a tired grin and said, "Should all watch something, maybe play cards, maybe eat leftovers in the living room and just relax." He said it with the kind of cheerfulness that comes from not noticing what's been happening around you, from assuming that smiles mean everything is fine. I nodded, said sure, and walked to the fridge to pull out what was left of the pasta. And just as I reached for the container, Jake came up behind me again. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand brushed against my lower back, light and deliberate, just enough to make my breath catch and my fingers falter on the plastic lid, and in that moment, I didn't move away. I should have. I knew I should have, but I didn't. And not because I was confused, not even because I was afraid, but because I was starting to understand something about myself I didn't want to admit. Greg stood in the doorway watching us, or maybe just waiting for the food, and said with a tired chuckle, "You and Jake really found your rhythm, huh? That's great. He's usually kind of a tough nut to crack." I turned, laughed softly, not really laughing, not really breathing, and said something about how we'd been managing just fine. Greg smiled, said he was glad, said this trip was good for us all. I nodded too quickly again. I always nodded too, quickly when I didn't want to lie but couldn't tell the truth. We ate dinner in that too small living room, the three of us crammed between the coffee table and the throw pillows, and I sat with my legs crossed and my plate balanced carefully, and my gaze fixed on the screen while Greg chose something light and forgettable to stream. I felt Jake's leg rest against mine once, not overtly, not even firmly, just lightly. Enough to make me aware, enough to make me question if it was me who hadn't moved or him who had gotten too close. I told myself to get up, to sit somewhere else, to say I was tired, but I stayed. When Greg went to shower before bed and I started collecting the plates, Jake leaned over, took mine from my hand, and said quietly, "You looked tired earlier. You okay?" I nodded. Of course I nodded, and stepped away. But my heart was beating too fast for how normal the moment had been. It was just after 10 again, when I passed the hallway. The bathroom light was on. I heard the water stop. The air smelled of shampoo and heat and steam. I didn't look. I kept walking. But then his voice came, low, calm, a little amused. "You sure you didn't see those shorts?" I turned. I didn't mean to, but I did. And there he was again, towel hanging loose, water tracing lines down his torso, a smirk almost playing at the edge of his mouth but never fully forming. My eyes caught his and then dropped and then returned, and in that flicker of movement I knew the truth. He wasn't going to stop looking, and I wasn't sure anymore if I wanted him to. That was the moment I knew everything had already changed. One morning when I was wearing a short robe, Jake positioned himself in the hallway and made a comment about how the color suited me. His tone was matter-of-fact rather than playful, and the way he looked at me was clearly inappropriate, as if he were describing the hue of a sky or the depth of water, and it settled into my skin like a weight that wouldn't shift no matter how tightly I tied the sash at my waist. Later that morning, after Greg had finished his first round of calls and asked me to help freshen up the sunroom before lunch, I started shaking out the throw blankets and fluffing the pillows while Jake moved beside me without needing to be asked. And we found ourselves folding the large beach coverlet together, the fabric soft and worn between our hands as we pulled, the corners inward in that awkward, coordinated rhythm two people always find when working on something neither of them wants to do alone. His hand brushed mine once, then drifted lower near my hip, not touching but close enough that I felt the heat radiate across the cotton of my dress. And just then, the bedroom door creaked, and Greg appeared in the doorway, holding a towel in. One hand, eyebrows raised but mouth still, his eyes landing on where Jake's arm hovered near my waist like a question no one wanted to ask. I stepped sharply to the side, letting the sheet drop into place too quickly, and said too loudly, he was helping. Greg didn't speak. He just nodded and turned back into the hallway with the same silence he had brought in, but I felt the charge in the air snap behind him like static across wet skin, and I knew that he had seen something, even if he didn't know exactly what it was. The afternoon pressed in with more heat than the morning, the kind that made the floorboards warm under bare feet and turned every room into a waiting space, too bright, too still, too full of things unsaid. I stepped out onto the terrace to get air and found music already playing, something soft and vaguely familiar drifting from the old Bluetooth speaker perched on the railing, and it took me a few seconds before I placed the melody, a song from a decade ago I hadn't thought of in years, a tune I used to hum without noticing while stuck in traffic or wiping down the counters late at night. The kind of song that lives in the corners of your brain without ever asking to be remembered. Jake was sitting with one foot propped on the edge of the lounge chair, scrolling through his phone like the music had just happened to appear, and when I asked, quieter than I meant to, "How do you even know that song?" He didn't look up as he said, "You've been humming it all week, under your breath, every morning while you make tea." There was no accusation in his voice, no smile, no pride, just fact. And I stood there, lips slightly parted, realizing how carefully he had been listening even when I thought I was alone. The kitchen was hotter than usual when I opened the fridge to look for the yogurt Greg liked, and I had just leaned forward to check the lower shelf when I felt movement behind me, the sudden stillness of someone entering the space without making a sound, and before I could straighten, Jake was there, not brushing past, not stepping aside, but standing directly behind me with barely an inch between our backs, his breath warming the side of my neck like he wasn't even trying to hide the distance he had closed. His voice came low, just above the hum of the fridge fan, and he said, "Sometimes you stand too open, you know? It's hard not to notice." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just closed the door slowly, eyes locked on the milk carton I didn't need, hands steadying themselves on the edge of the counter, because I knew that if I turned around, the space between us would vanish completely. The sun had dipped lower by the time we walked down to the beach together, Greg trailing. Behind us with his camera and a blanket, Jake carrying the cooler, and me holding the bag of towels that suddenly felt heavier than it should. The breeze had cooled slightly, but not enough to shake the warmth from my skin, and when Jake handed me the bottle of sunscreen, our fingers touched again. Lightly, casually, but longer than necessary, with the kind of pause that made me forget what else I had been holding. He smiled, not wide but enough to pull one corner of his mouth, and leaned in just close enough to ask, "Want me to do your back?" His tone was level, polite, the way someone might offer to open a jar or carry a chair, but I felt the flush rise in my chest like fire underwater, and I shook my head too quickly, too sharply, hearing the breath catch in my own throat as I answered, "No, I've got it." He nodded without protest, with that same infuriating calm he always carried, and I hated the way his smile stayed even after he turned toward the water. That night, I couldn't fall asleep the way I usually did, with my back to the open window and the hum of distant waves lulling me down like a worn-out lullaby, because every sound in the house felt closer than it should have, more deliberate, than the creaks and shifts of coastal wood that were supposed to be natural in these types of rentals. I lay still for what must have been over an hour, eyes open in the dark, blanket pulled too tightly across my chest, until I heard it, soft footsteps across the hallway, careful but not hesitant, followed by the faintest rustle of fabric or breath or presence, I couldn't be sure which. I held my breath, not out of fear, but something far stranger, something I didn't have words for yet, and listened for the click of a door or the whisper of movement. But there was nothing but the quiet again, the kind that stretches across walls and skin and makes you wonder if anything really happened at all. Then another creak, lower, like a shift of weight on the hallway floor, and just as quickly, silence. I didn't know if he had been in my doorway or just in my head, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure which version scared me more. Next morning, I woke up early, not from rest, but from that leftover tension that lives in your back and behind your ribs. And when I opened the closet to pull out something clean to wear, my hand brushed against a folded t-shirt that wasn't mine, dark gray, soft cotton, unmistakably not from my side of the shelf. It smelled faintly of ocean air and detergent, and as soon as I saw the tag, I knew it was Jake's, the one he wore the first day we got here, the one I had noticed without trying to. It was tucked in with my cardigans, sitting right on top, like it belonged there, and I snatched it up with the kind of impulse that doesn't leave room for logic, flung it to the floor without thinking, heart pounding like I'd caught something in the act. I stared at it for a full minute. The fabric crumpled like it had been dropped accidentally, like it hadn't been placed there, and then, without knowing why, I bent down, picked it up, and smoothed it out slowly with both hands like it was mine to care for. My fingers lingered longer than they should have, and I hated the way my thoughts twisted around something so small, so ordinary, and made it feel like evidence. Greg came in around noon with a mug of his usual instant coffee, and that look he wore when he wanted to be supportive but not intrusive, and after a few seconds of standing in the doorway, he said, "You've been different since we got here. Lighter somehow, like you're finally relaxing." I looked up from the chopping board, hands still sticky with peach juice, and gave him the closest thing to a smile I could manage, though it didn't reach my chest. "Maybe it's just the weather," I said, voice too even, too ready, and I turned back to the fruit like the sweetness on my fingers could distract me from how far off the mark that answer really was. Because it wasn't the weather, and we both knew it, even if he couldn't name what else it might be. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared again, soft streaks of gold stretching across the patio as the breeze carried the scent of seaweed and salt into the open kitchen. And I found myself lingering at the edge of the deck door, watching Greg fiddle with the propane tank on the grill while Jake stood a few feet away, barefoot, shirtless again, sipping from a cold bottle of water and watching me without apology. I stayed in the shadow of the doorframe longer than I should have, long enough to feel the glass warming under my palm, long enough for his eyes to meet mine and hold them there without flinching. That was what made it worse. Not the heat or the silence or the nearness, but the complete lack of shame, the way he looked at me like he already knew I wouldn't turn away, like the rules had shifted when I wasn't looking and now it was up to me to pretend nothing had changed. Dinner passed like a script we'd all memorized. Wine glasses filled halfway. Greg telling a story from work, me laughing in the right places, Jake nodding like he was present. But under the table, I kept my feet folded tightly under my chair, back straight, breath measured, because I couldn't risk a single unplanned gesture. When Greg left the table to take a client call he'd forgotten about, Jake reached for the corkscrew without speaking, topped off my glass before I could wave it away, and sat back like nothing in the world required urgency. I sipped the wine without tasting it. I focused on the clock. I waited for noise, for footsteps, for something to interrupt the silence between us. But nothing came. When I went to wash the dishes, I expected him to stay seated, expected at least, that some illusion of distance, some moment of space. But he followed, slow and steady, and leaned against the opposite counter with arms folded, and that unreadable expression he always wore when he wanted me to notice him and say nothing about it. I washed one plate at a time, careful, methodical, pretending I didn't see him in the reflection of the window, or feel the weight of his gaze where the strap of my dress had slipped half an inch. That night, I laid awake longer than I wanted. Too, long after Greg fell asleep beside me, with the soft rise and fall of someone who had nothing to question. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slow shadows across the walls and tried to remember what I had worn that first day, the color of my robe, the smell of the tea, the last time I had felt like myself in a room where Jake wasn't watching. Because now, even in the silence, I wasn't sure where he ended and I began. The kitchen was too quiet for morning, and the air inside felt heavier than it should have for a space that usually smelled like toast and lemon and half-spoken plans for the day. And as I stepped in barefoot, the tiles cool under my feet and the light creeping sideways through the blinds, I saw Jake already at the sink with his back to the room, shoulders relaxed like he wasn't waiting for anything, like he belonged there more than I did. He didn't glance up as I entered, didn't shift or make room or pretend to be doing anything at all except watching the water slip through his fingers, and I hesitated for the briefest second before walking past him toward the cabinet to reach for the jar of tea I no longer needed to label because he already knew the kind I drank. He turned then, just enough that our arms brushed, just enough to make it clear he had never intended to move aside, and as I stepped closer to the counter, his hand lifted, not slowly, not hesitantly, and pressed firmly around mine, not grabbing or tugging, but holding with full contact, with the kind of pressure that speaks before words do. And I froze without meaning to because my hand didn't jerk away and my mouth didn't form the protest I thought I had ready. And instead, I stood still while his palm rested against mine like it had every right to be there. Like we had already crossed that line and were both just pretending it hadn't happened yet. He didn't release me as he shifted closer, not with speed but with certainty, and his shoulder pressed gently into mine, not enough to knock me off balance but enough to make me lean slightly without realizing it, and his head tilted just enough that I could feel his breath near my temple even though he didn't say anything for several seconds, and then in a voice low and calm and stripped of any performance, he murmured, "You smell like the air before a storm." The words didn't land like poetry or affection or flattery. They landed like fact, quiet and inescapable, and I stared down at the seam in the floor tile, at the blurred reflection of the light along the baseboards. Because I didn't trust my voice and I didn't trust the way my chest trembled under the thin fabric of my t-shirt. I didn't ask what he meant, and I didn't laugh like it was a joke because it wasn't. And even if it had been, I wouldn't have found it funny, not with the way his presence filled the room and my senses like something permanent and irreversible. The silence between us stretched wider than the distance of the small kitchen, and I stepped slightly to the side, not to escape, but to find breath, to remember that my body still moved by will, and I looked at him, fully this time, with the weight of everything I hadn't said pressed into my spine, and without blinking. I said, "You're playing a dangerous game." My voice didn't waver, and my hands didn't shake, and I wanted to believe that counted for something, but he didn't flinch, and he didn't retreat, and he only tilted his head the other way, and said, "And you're pretending to be out of reach." There was no challenge in his voice, no heat, no push, only that same relentless certainty, and we both went quiet again because anything else would have been dishonest. What happened next didn't start with intention or decision or even accident. It started with momentum. Not the fast kind that rushes in like wind, but the slow kind that has been building for days in glances and pauses, and the gravity between two people who haven't spoken the truth aloud, but already know it. His mouth found mine without force, without question, and the kiss wasn't quick or hesitant or exploratory. It was steady and deep and anchored in a stillness that made the rest of the house disappear, and I answered it, not in reaction, but in recognition. Because the moment his lips met mine, something inside me gave way without resistance. He pressed me gently back toward the refrigerator, not pushing but guiding, and my spine met the cool surface while his hands found the edges of my hips like they'd been there before, and my fingers, traitorous, certain, alive, moved to his arms, to his back, to the base of his neck, and I didn't stop them because I didn't want to. The seconds stretched and broke and reformed into something I couldn't name, and the kiss deepened not with hunger but with clarity, like we were telling each other something we had never dared put into words. And when I finally pulled away, not with force, but with a breath that didn't fully reach my lungs, I felt my hand press flat against his chest like I was making sure he was real, and he stepped back just barely and said, "It already happened." His voice wasn't smug, and it wasn't apologetic, and it wasn't anything except true, and I stood there not saying anything because there was nothing left to deny. I nodded, once, tightly, like I was confirming something for both of us, and he didn't wait for more. He turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, without looking back, and I stayed exactly where I was with my fingers curled in at my sides, and my breath still uneven and my heart making a sound inside, my chest that I didn't recognize. I turned to the sink and reached for the faucet with hands that weren't steady, and I scrubbed my palms and wrists under the cold water, again and again, not because they were dirty, not because I could wash anything away, but because I didn't know what else to do with the silence he had left behind. The water kept running long after the soap had faded and my skin had turned raw under the stream, and I didn't stop until I heard Greg's voice from the back patio, cheerful and worn, calling out something about the morning catch, and I shut off the faucet and dried my hands and smoothed my shirt and stepped into the hallway with a smile already forming that didn't belong to me. Greg stepped into the kitchen with the smell of lake water still clinging to his sleeves and the soft scuff of sand trailing from his shoes, his face flushed from the sun and the quiet pride of a good catch. And when he saw me by the counter, he paused mid-step, holding the small cooler in one hand and grinning like he hadn't smiled that freely in weeks. And then he said it, so casually, so naturally, it almost broke me. "You're glowing, you know that?" The words landed with the warmth of a compliment meant to comfort, but the way they twisted in my stomach made it hard to breathe for a moment, and I forced the corners of my mouth to lift just enough to match the shape of his joy, nodding faintly, as I answered, "Must be the sun." hoping he wouldn't hear the catch in my throat or the way my fingers curled into the dish towel I hadn't realized I was still holding. He stepped past me to set the cooler on the table and leaned in to kiss the side of my head, his lips brushing my temple without suspicion, and I felt the weight of his trust like a second spine pressing against mine, not in punishment but in quiet exposure. And as he turned to unpack the catch, I stayed near the sink pretending to adjust the towel on the rack, my hands shaking slightly with the effort to look unshaken. I watched his movements in the reflection of the microwave door, the way he sorted through the ice and the tangle of fishing line and plastic bags, and I thought about the shape of his fingers and how different they felt from the ones that had touched me earlier. How familiar they were and how far away they suddenly seemed, like memories of another season I couldn't step back into, no matter how hard I tried. I told myself to breathe, to speak, to do something that restored the shape of normalcy between us. But before I could find the words, Jake passed through the hallway on his way to the stairs, and our eyes met, just briefly, just long enough. And in that narrow moment of shared space, something passed between us that neither of us tried to hide or soften or explain. There was no guilt in his face, no apology, no question, just a look of knowing that didn't ask for anything because it already understood everything. And as he turned the corner and disappeared up the steps, I stood there in the kitchen with the taste of the morning still in my mouth and the echo of his voice still humming beneath my skin. And I realized nothing about this was an accident anymore. I finished rinsing the last of the glasses while Greg prepared the grill, his voice floating through the open sliding door as he talked about marinade and propane and the perfect sear. And I nodded when he called out for the tongs, pretended to laugh at the joke I didn't catch, and handed him the tools with a hand that still remembered the grip of someone else's fingers. I watched him work for a while, watched the way the lines of his shoulders moved with effort and ease, and I hated how many years I had spent loving him properly, and how none of that had stopped my body from answering someone else's touch just hours earlier. The sun moved higher and the day settled into a pattern we'd all come to expect. Music from someone's phone, sandals kicked near the door, the slow rhythm of a vacation that lulled everyone into forgetting time, and I tried to match that rhythm, tried to fold myself back into the version of me that had existed before Jake started looking at me like I was more than just his father's new wife, but the truth was I couldn't remember how that version of me felt anymore. Every time I moved through a doorway or stepped into the light, I wondered if he would be there, not out of fear or hope, but out of inevitability, because we had crossed something irreversible, and now the only thing left was waiting to see what it would cost. I poured iced tea into Greg's glass and offered him a napkin and commented on the weather like I cared about the clouds. And when he leaned in to kiss me again, I let him, because my mouth still knew how to answer his, even if the rest of me didn't. I let the hours pass the way the tide does, slow, relentless, carrying pieces of what had once been whole out to sea, and I wondered how long I could keep pretending that I hadn't already begun to disappear. That evening, as the sky turned copper and the air thickened with the promise of another hot night, I stood near the top of the stairs folding towels. That didn't need folding, and I heard Jake's door open behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't speak. I just waited. He moved past me without touching, without slowing, without even glancing directly, but as his shoulder aligned with mine, he paused. Not with his body, not with his steps, but with his presence. And I felt the weight of his awareness like a hand resting against the small of my back, steady and quiet and unmistakable. Our eyes met as he stepped onto the lower landing, and in that single locked moment, there was no pretense left. There was no shame, no apology, no anger, only clarity. He didn't smile, and I didn't look away, and by the time he turned the corner into the living room, I knew that this was no longer something that had simply happened. This was something that had started. The water was still running when I heard the door creak behind me, my fingers tangled in the towel I had just pulled from the hook, the strands of my wet hair clinging to the back of my neck and soaking through the thin white tank top I hadn't thought twice about wearing when I stepped out of the shower, and before I could turn to see who it was, Jake was there, already holding out another towel in my direction, already close enough that the steam between us felt like part of him. He didn't speak, just extended his arm, the folded cotton balanced in his hand like a quiet offering, and I reached for it without hesitation, my hand brushing his, the water still dripping from my wrist to the tile floor below us in slow, uneven taps that somehow sounded too loud in the small bathroom. I didn't thank him, and he didn't ask me to. But behind us came another sound, the unmistakable rustle of shoes on the wood outside the door, the soft shift of air that comes with someone entering too quietly, and before I could take a full breath, Greg's voice cut into the space like a crack in glass as he asked, "You couldn't get it yourself?" His tone wasn't raised, wasn't angry, just puzzled in a way that made the moment break harder, and I turned to face him with the towel now gripped to my chest, my voice as steady as I could manage as I said, "He was closer." The lie didn't taste like panic, but in my stomach a hard knot twisted itself tighter than it had ever been, and when Greg glanced at Jake, then back at me, and nodded once without pressing further, I felt a shift I didn't know how to name. As if the air around us had taken a snapshot, no one would claim, but no one would forget either. That night the book in my hands blurred line after line as I sat curled in the corner of the couch, trying to pretend I still cared what the characters were doing, and Jake moved behind me like he had always belonged there. His presence sinking into the room like an old scent you stopped noticing until it became memory, and when his hand reached for the side of my neck with the same calm precision he used for everything else, I didn't flinch. His fingers brushed lightly across the curve beneath my ear. Not tender, not forceful, just present, and he whispered without leaning in, "You get slower when you're afraid we'll be seen." My breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition, and I closed the book softly. Not because I was finished, but because I no longer needed to pretend I was reading. His hand didn't leave my skin as it moved downward, tracing the space between shoulder and hip with the kind of stillness that doesn't ask permission because it's already answered. And when it reached my thigh, I felt the jolt pulse through me before I could stop it, the way my body tensed in reflex and then almost instantly softened again as I leaned into his weight. He didn't move faster. He didn't speak. His hand slid across my side with the slow intent of someone claiming more than touch. And I realized this wasn't tenderness. This was assertion. This was the soundless way someone teaches you to stop pretending you have lines left to draw. Turned my head, not to look at him, not to meet his eyes, but to breathe without him touching that breath too. And I said, "We can't. I'm your father's wife." I didn't expect him to apologize, didn't expect restraint or shame or even hesitation, and I didn't get it. He answered with a voice like smoke through steel as he said, "I'm not a child, and you know that." He didn't add anything else because he didn't need to, because the weight of what he was claiming wasn't in the words. It was in the way I hadn't stepped away. The kitchen was darker than usual, the bulbs above the counter casting long, uneven shadows that bent across the floor like cracks in an old painting, and when Jake and I were alone there after Greg had gone to bed early with a headache and silence in his footsteps, there were no accidents left to pretend about. I was placing dishes into the rack when he stepped behind me, closer than usual, his breath warm against my shoulder as his lips found the curve of my neck, with the same calm certainty he always carried. And I didn't move because I didn't want to. He kissed my shoulder, then my jaw, then my mouth, and I turned into him because pretending not to had become the lie I couldn't keep straight. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay beside Greg as he shifted in his dreams and murmured something I couldn't hear, and I stared at the ceiling with my hands pressed against my own chest, as if I could quiet the rhythm inside. When morning came, he stretched with a yawn and asked casually, "You two were in the kitchen last night?" I nodded slowly, forcing my face into something easy, and said, "Yeah, we were unpacking some bags." He looked at me for a beat, too long, then nodded like he believed me but didn't understand why it felt incomplete. And when he said, "Seemed like a long time for groceries," I didn't answer because no answer would have been safe enough to hold up. That evening, Jake stood near the back door watching the trees shift in the wind while I hovered near the window, pretending to read the weather instead of the weight in the room. And after a long stretch of stillness, he spoke without turning. "You already chose. You're just scared someone else will say it out loud." The truth in those words hollowed my breath, and I said nothing, because the silence between us had stopped being fear and started being confirmation. Late one evening, I went to Jake's room. He was expecting me. I entered without explanation or hesitation, as we had both moved past the point of pretending this wasn't going to happen. He didn't speak as he closed the door behind me, didn't reach for me right away, didn't try to fill the space with declarations or reassurances that neither of us believed in anymore, and I stood near the edge of the bed with my arms folded, in front of me like I was still trying to carry the shape of decency across the threshold, though we both knew it hadn't survived the hallway. I could hear the slow hum of the ceiling fan and the faint movement of the wind through the cracked window, and I thought for a moment how strange it was that everything could feel this still when the weight of what we were doing should have made the world tilt. He walked past me without touching, pulled the curtains shut with one hand like it was habit rather than secrecy, and when he turned back toward me, his eyes didn't hold question or doubt or even desire. They held certainty. The kind that doesn't need permission and doesn't beg forgiveness, and I hated that part of me mirrored it so fully. He didn't ask what I wanted, didn't check to see if I was sure, because we had passed those points long ago and now we were in the thick of a choice that had already begun choosing us. His hand reached toward mine with no urgency, his fingers closing over mine the way someone takes hold of something they've already decided belongs to them, and I let him lead me gently toward the bed, not like a scene unfolding, but like a truth arriving, one step at a time. His breath caught for the first time, just briefly, and I felt a flicker of something shift in his chest beneath my hand, something raw and rooted, and I leaned in closer, not to chase it but to meet it. We stayed like that, connected and quiet, our bodies aligned but not frantic, our touch deliberate rather than hungry, because this wasn't about indulgence or escape. This was about inevitability. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, he didn't say anything, and neither did I, because there was no more need for words to dress what we both already understood. We sat there breathing, just breathing, and that sound alone felt louder than anything we'd whispered in days. I returned to my room without making a sound, the hallway darker than it had been when I left it, the house hushed in that eerie way that made everything feel overheard even in silence. I slipped back beneath the sheets beside Greg, who didn't stir as I settled into the space I had warmed hours before, and I stared up at the ceiling again with my pulse throbbing slow and thick through my wrists, wondering how much longer I could exist between these two truths before one of them demanded to be said aloud. When morning came, the light poured across the foot of the bed like it had always done, careless and golden and blind to what it illuminated, and Greg sat up with a stretch and a groggy smile, reaching for his glasses before turning to me. He was quiet for a moment, squinting toward the kitchen, and then asked casually, "You two were in there again last night?" My stomach clenched so fast I barely had time to steady my voice, and I said evenly, "Yeah, we were putting things away from the store," though the bags had been empty for hours and the counters wiped clean long before Greg had fallen asleep. He tilted his head slightly, watching me a second too long, then said, "Felt like a while for a couple of bags." And he waited just long enough for a response I didn't have. I didn't offer one. I simply looked down at my hands, fingers, laced too tightly in my lap, and let the pause stretch far enough that the subject faded into whatever place half-truths go to wait. Later, the rhythm of the house returned. Coffee brewed, chairs shifted, windows opened, and I went about the motions like someone trying to walk through a mirror without cracking the glass. That evening, as I stood by the dining room window, watching the tide push against the sand with the same quiet violence I felt inside, Jake entered without announcing himself, his reflection lining up with mine against the dark glass. And he didn't need to say anything for me to know he had seen the way I held my breath all day. But then he spoke, his voice so level it sounded rehearsed even though it wasn't. "You already chose. You're just scared someone else will say it out loud." I didn't look at him, I didn't correct him, I didn't deny it. I simply stared through the glass as if the horizon might rearrange itself into something simpler, something gentler, something that didn't look so much like me standing exactly where I no longer belonged. When the night settled again and the house dimmed to the quiet hum of lights being clicked off and doors softly closed, I moved down the hallway without hesitation, every step stripped of the illusion I had clung to in earlier days. I reached his room and paused for only half a second before lifting my hand, not to knock but to let it fall against the doorframe in a rhythm he already knew. He opened the door like he'd been standing just behind it all along, his face calm, unsurprised as if this was just the next page we'd both already read, and when I stepped inside, he didn't ask why I came, and I didn't need to explain, because this time we didn't whisper, we didn't hide. And the house had already started to listen. I opened my mouth to answer, maybe with something real, maybe with something foolish, but the sound that came next didn't belong to either of us. Greg discovered us in bed together the next morning. The intimate nature of our positioning and state of undress made the situation unmistakably clear to him, leading to the revelation of our affair. The air turned so heavy, I felt it in my throat, in my teeth, in the small of my back where the sweat hadn't even dried from the hour before, and Greg stood there for 1 second too long before he exhaled with something so quiet I might have mistaken it for a sigh if I didn't know him better. He tilted his head just slightly and said, "I don't understand." His voice wasn't raised, it wasn't pleading. It was flat and so stripped of emotion that I almost wished he'd shouted, and then he took one small step forward, lowered the mug slightly and added, "No, wait, I do. I get it now." His eyes didn't leave me when he said it, and I didn't. Reach for the sheet, didn't hide behind anything, didn't defend or explain because there was nothing left that could change the fact that he was looking at the truth with both eyes open. He lifted the mug like it meant nothing. Like it was just part of his hand now, and in one clean motion, he turned and hurled it at the wall beside the dresser, the ceramic exploding into shards so sharp and fast that I flinched before I realized they weren't aimed at me. The pieces clattered to the floor with a sound that didn't stop echoing even after the silence returned, and then he was gone, turning without another word, walking out of the room, not like he had been hurt, but like he had finally made a decision that had taken too long to arrive. I didn't chase him. I didn't scream his name or beg for a pause or grab at the doorway, because I knew better. I knew this wasn't the moment everything went wrong. This was the moment he finally saw that it had already happened. Jake sat up completely, one hand braced against the mattress, his jaw tight but his breath steady, and he looked at me not with fear or apology, but with something that burned a little darker, something that held no room for pretending we could rewind. He said it plainly, without hesitation, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask, "I don't regret it." His voice was still low, but this time it didn't carry softness, and I nodded because the knot in my chest had already unraveled and I wasn't going to lie to myself anymore. And I said, "Then I guess I've got nothing left to lose." The words tasted like iron and silence and maybe something close to relief, but there was no freedom in them, only the kind of finality that comes after the damage is already too visible to deny. Neither of us moved for a long time. The room didn't breathe. The house felt emptied out even though he hadn't taken anything yet, and I sat there in the mess of morning light and broken decisions knowing there was no version of this that ended without cost. The floor still held the remains of Greg's silence, the wall scarred by the impact of what he didn't say, and the air clung to my skin like guilt that had nowhere left to hide. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, my hands over my face. Not because I was crying, but because I had forgotten how to look at anything without wanting to unsee it. Jake didn't reach for me. He didn't speak again. He just sat there watching the same morning that would not erase us no matter how long we waited. We had crossed from choice into consequence, and the door behind us was still open. The hours that followed didn't feel like time, but like weight. Like something invisible had settled across the walls and pressed down hard enough that even the wind outside seemed quieter than usual, as if the house itself had started holding its breath. Greg didn't return to the room, didn't call out, didn't slam another door, or demand explanations, and by late afternoon, the front door opened once, then closed with a soft, certain click that didn't need volume to carry finality. I didn't get up from the edge of the bed where I had been sitting since morning, my arms wrapped around my waist like they could hold something in that had already spilled. Jake moved in and out of the room a few times, never asking where Greg went or what would happen next. And I didn't ask either, because some truths arrive quietly and then just stay, not needing witnesses. The silence spread, long and deliberate, stretching through the house like fog, and by the time I finally walked into the living room, the evidence of his absence had already begun to shape itself into something permanent. The coat he always left on the back of the chair was gone, the shoes that lived near the door had vanished, the coffee cup from that morning had been rinsed and placed upside down beside the sink like a final, careful gesture. The photo frame, above the fireplace, the one with the three of us from last Thanksgiving, the first and only time we had all looked like a real family, had been taken down, and I could still see the outline of its dust-free rectangle against the wood grain, like a scar. The space it left felt loud. The drawer in the hallway where he kept spare keys and takeout menus had been emptied. His laptop was missing, the power cord too. By nightfall, it was clear. He had left not out of rage, not out of desperation, but with method, with intention, with a quiet clarity that only comes when someone understands there's nothing left to wait for. I didn't call him. I didn't check my phone for messages. I didn't open the banking app, though I knew without asking that the joint account had been closed because I had watched him scroll through the screen right before he walked into the room that morning with a mug in one hand and the world ending in the other. He had always been exact like that. Not cruel, not theatrical, just precise. And when he left like someone closing a file drawer they never planned to reopen. The kitchen was colder than usual when I stepped in after sunset, the lights off, the dishes still stacked in the sink, untouched since the night before, and I sat on the floor beneath the window, not because I couldn't find a chair, but because the cold tiles grounded me in a way nothing else could. I pulled Jake's shirt tighter around my knees, his scent still woven into the fabric from 2 days ago, and curled into myself like that shape might offer protection from what I already knew was coming. I didn't cry. There were no tears left that would have made sense. I just sat there, arms wrapped tight around my legs, head pressed against my knees, letting the silence press in from all sides until the house didn't feel like a home anymore, just a place where something had collapsed. Jake didn't come into the kitchen. He stayed upstairs. Whether it was by mercy or distance or confusion, I couldn't tell, but I knew if he stepped into that room now, I wouldn't have the strength to speak. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Everything we had done was still clinging to the walls and windows, not as memory but as atmosphere, and now there was nothing left to hide behind. Not the long glances, not the quiet, not the timing, not even the excuses. What had started in whispers and breath had ended in broken porcelain and absence, and now I was alone in the part of the story no one ever prepares for. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and indifferent, and I thought about how strange it was that everything around me kept working when everything inside me had gone still. I stared at the grooves in the floor tiles until they blurred, and I thought of Greg's last look, not full of rage or pain, but something more dangerous, something final. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't asked why, because he had seen enough to know the answer without needing to hear it spoken. I ran my hand over my shin slowly, the small bones beneath my skin sharper than I remembered, and I realized that I was still here not because I was waiting for something, but because I had nowhere else to go. The house was no longer a hiding place. It was the aftermath. It was the evidence. The clock ticked on the microwave, and I watched it turn from 8:04 to 8:05, the minute passing like a sentence instead of time, and I closed my eyes just long enough to picture something that didn't feel like guilt, not relief, not love, not even regret, just quiet. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want to speak, because everything had already been said, because now I wore Jake's shirt, but I was alone. 2 days passed without a single vibration from my phone, without the screen lighting up with his name or any sign that the person I had built my second chance with even existed anymore. And the longer the silence stretched, the heavier it felt, like time was no longer moving forward but pressing inward, closing around, me with the slow certainty of something irreversible. The windows stayed open despite the heat, because the stillness inside the house was worse than the thick coastal air that settled into my skin and made even my breath feel borrowed, and I walked from room to room not because I was looking for something, but because I couldn't stay still without remembering what it had felt like to be looked at by both of them in such different ways, one with belief and one with hunger, both now gone. I kept thinking maybe I'd hear from Greg, maybe a message, a request, an insult, anything to break the space he'd left behind, but the only notification that arrived came from the bank, a terse alert on the app that told me the card had been declined at the grocery store, and when I tried to refresh the balance, the screen went white for 2 seconds and then showed nothing at all. The mortgage had never been in my name. The utilities came through his company, the passwords to the accounts were saved in his browser. The house I had moved into and learned to love was his, not in theory, not in feeling, but in paperwork, in law, in reality. And now I was just someone borrowing a shell that no longer belonged to the life we had created inside it. I sat on the edge of the couch with my knees drawn up and my phone still in my palm like it might change its mind if I stared long enough. But no calls came, no texts appeared, and the battery slipped lower like everything else, quietly and without negotiation. Jake stayed one more night after Greg left, his presence heavier than ever, no longer wrapped in the thrill of secrecy but weighed down by the truth of consequence. And we barely spoke because there was nothing left to hide behind, and no language that could flatten what we had done into something manageable. He didn't try to touch me, didn't reach across the bed or stand too close or ask questions that would force me to say out loud the things we had both already felt rip through the walls of this house like wind that doesn't leave anything upright. In the morning, he packed his bag with the kind of methodical calm I had watched Greg use the day he left, folding shirts and stacking notebooks and zipping his hoodie without a glance in the mirror. And when he stood by the door with his car, keys in his palm and his backpack slung over one shoulder, he didn't try to prolong the moment. He looked at me and said, "We'll talk again when you're ready to be honest." And his voice didn't shake, and neither did mine, because I didn't answer. I sat on the edge of the bed after he left, the same bed where everything had splintered, and I stared at the small dent his suitcase had left in the rug, as if I could preserve the indentation of his absence long enough to remind myself that he had been real, that I hadn't imagined the pressure, the heat, the certainty with which he had crossed every line and made me do the same. The day passed slowly after that, with no plan, no list, no calls, just the ache of an ending that had arrived without structure or ceremony. I stayed in the house one more night, not because I thought someone might come back, but because I didn't know where else to go, because the world outside those walls felt as unfamiliar as the silence inside them, and I wasn't ready yet to leave the wreckage behind. In the morning, I opened the drawer beside the sink and found the last sachet of the jasmine tea Jake used to make for me before I asked and after I stopped asking, and I carried it down to the edge of the ocean where the tide was beginning to rise again. I crouched in the sand with the wind pulling my hair across my face and the sky already starting to change, and I held the tea in my fist so tightly the paper softened in my palm. I didn't speak, didn't say goodbye, didn't try to assign meaning to something that had already gone too far, and I tossed the sachet into the water without flair, without ceremony, and watched the waves pull it apart like it had never mattered at all. By midday, an email arrived from Greg. No greeting, no explanation, no paragraph trying to reshape what he had seen into something digestible. It was a single file attachment, a document labeled simply with my name and the word final. The message body contained only one line. "Don't look for me. I'm not looking for you." I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't scream or curse or close the laptop too hard. I just sat there with the glow of the screen on my hands, and the hum of the refrigerator behind me, and the shape of my name staring back at me like it didn't belong to the person I remembered being before that morning. I moved slowly through the guest room closet that afternoon, the one we had never really filled, and I found the photo in the back of the drawer, the print we had framed once and then taken down and then lost track of, the one of all three of us on the beach last summer, squinting into the sun and holding beers and pretending not to notice how awkward our spacing had been even then. I looked at it for a long time before I tore it once across the center, then again diagonally, the sound of the paper ripping louder than I expected, and I stood with the pieces in my hand like maybe I could just let them fall. But instead, I pulled open the junk drawer, found a roll of tape, and pressed the image together strip by strip, not to restore it, not to display it, not to preserve anything hopeful, but to remember exactly what I had destroyed. The eye-eyed photo sat on the kitchen counter for hours after I had taped it back together, the creases splitting across our faces like scars that refused to heal, and I couldn't stop staring at the places where our smiles had been cut, rejoined, misaligned, where my hand had once rested on Greg's shoulder like a claim, and Jake's arm had stretched around both of us like he already knew how to disappear from the picture even while he was in it. I didn't frame it. I didn't hide it. I left it face up like evidence, not because I wanted to remember the good or mourn the loss, but because I needed to see what I had done without looking away. The rooms felt different after that. Not just empty, but weightless in the way that only comes when something permanent has broken loose, when even gravity seems embarrassed to stay. I walked through the hallway with my fingers grazing the walls I once wiped clean every Sunday afternoon, and I realized I knew every crack in the paint, every scratch from moving furniture, every corner where the light hit just right to remind me we were never as flawless as we had tried to look. But the worst crack wasn't in the walls or the doors or the mirror above the stairs. It was the one I hadn't noticed forming in myself, the one that split wide the moment I stopped, resisting and started wanting. I hadn't known what it would cost. I hadn't cared. The next morning, I packed with no urgency, no plan, and no destination beyond away. I left the closet half full because none of it felt like mine, and I didn't bother folding most of it, just pushed clothes into a soft duffel and zipped it without checking twice. I unplugged the coffee maker but didn't clean it. I emptied the fridge but left one jar of jam that wasn't mine. I wiped the counters, but not the windows. I didn't write a note. I didn't lock the back door. I wasn't sure if I hoped someone would come after me or just wanted the wind to take over when I was gone. Before leaving, I sat in the living room one last time, in the chair by the window, where I used to drink tea and pretend I could rebuild whatever marriage I thought I still had, and I stayed there until the sky started to fade into something between afternoon and evening. The photo was still on the counter and I didn't take it. I left it beside the empty fruit bowl like a warning. Not to whoever walked in next, but to myself, in case I ever forgot that destruction doesn't always come with fire or shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in softness, in stillness, in touch. I slipped off my sandals at the edge of the path where the pavement gave way to sand, and I walked barefoot across the shore, the grains clinging to my skin like guilt that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to let go. The ocean was quiet, steady, too calm for the storm I felt moving just under my ribs, and I stepped toward the waterline with the sandals in one hand and my sleeves rolled high up my arms like I was preparing to wade into something deeper than what waited at my feet. My body felt lighter than it should have, not with freedom, but with the absence of weight I had carried for too long without acknowledging how much of it I had put there myself. The wind tangled my hair in slow, deliberate knots, and I let it, because I was done trying to smooth things that were already too twisted to fix. I stared ahead, not at the horizon, but just beyond it, where the sun was beginning to lower with that indifferent kind of beauty that makes you hate it a little. The shoreline stretched on both sides, dotted with shells and seaweed and the occasional forgotten towel, and I walked without thinking about how far I'd gone, how far I'd need to return, or if I'd return at all. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't count the steps. I didn't check the time. I just kept walking with my feet sinking slightly into the wet sand, my fingers clenching the sandals like they were the only thing tethering me to a version of myself that had once believed in rules, in roles, in limits I would never cross. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel punished. I just felt hollow, like someone who had pressed too hard on the glass and watched it shatter without understanding what her hands were really capable of. I had thought I knew myself. I had thought my breaking point would look different. I had thought betrayal needed anger to make it real. But in the end, it hadn't been a scream or a slap or a door ripped off its hinges. It had been a whisper against my neck, a finger across my side, a moment where I didn't say no, and now it's walked alone, not because someone had abandoned me, but because I had burned every bridge without checking if I knew how to swim. The wind picked up slightly, sharp and clean and almost kind, and I paused near a patch of flat sand where the water had just retreated, the foam disappearing like it had never been, and I closed my eyes because the weight behind them was finally too much to hold. I stood, there with my sandals in one hand and nothing in the other, my hair across my face and the ocean behind me, and the empty house too far to see, and in that moment there was no past and no future, just the sound of my breath and the truth I couldn't unlive. I didn't know how I would rebuild. I didn't know what came next. I only knew one thing. I didn't set out to ruin anything. I just wanted to feel.